U.S. Mexico relations, Arturo Sarukhan joins us from Mexico City. He served as Mexico's ambassador to the United States from 2007 to 2013, and I want to thank you for joining us on the broadcast. Ambassador, you were at a symposium on the relationship between the United States and Mexico last year when Gordon Hanson said with NAFTA at 20, the U.S. and Mexico are like an old married couple. Part of the romance is gone. Is that true, and how can the two nations actually get that spark back?
Hi, Mike. It's great to be with you. Look, it is true. NAFTA is 20 years old. It's a free trade agreement that was negotiated when the global economy was very different from what it looks like today. It needs to be upgraded and modernized. I think a great part of the agenda that we saw today in Washington between Presidents Obama and President Peña Nieto is precisely to upgrade and modernize this trading relationship, which is critically important to the future well-being, prosperity of both nations. We trade $1.4 billion a day of goods, but we have to modernize our border infrastructure, which is woefully inadequate. We have to compatibilize how we deal with joint security on the border with facilitating that $1.4 billion of trade that goes back and forth every day. So yes, it's a 20-year-old deal. It needs to be upgraded. But this is why, for example, the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, in which Mexico and the US and Canada are participating in, could be a very important piece in how we pull up NAFTA from the bootstraps and insert it into the 21st century global economy.
Give me a sense of the relationship between these two countries, given the fact that you're looking at two presidents dealing with their own issues domestically. I mean, it's ironic the president of the United States meeting with Peña Nieto as this Republican Congress taking over. And of course, Peña Nieto arrives in Washington, still haunted. There's protesters outside the White House. He's dealing with his own domestic issues.
Look, this is one of the most complex, dynamic bilateral relationships on the face of the earth. And in many ways, it is a relationship that is deeply entwined in the domestic politics of both countries. What happens between the White House and the U.S. Congress plays a very important role and impacts the U.S. Mexico bilateral agenda. What happens domestically in Mexico, whether it's some of the very significant reforms that have been approved by Mexico's Congress this past year, whether it's some of these very relevant and pressing issues of human rights, all these issues impact the bilateral relationship between these two countries. So yes, domestic politics play a very significant role in how the relationship moves forward. Sort of Tip O'Neill, remember, used to say, all politics is local. In this case, everything in the bilateral agenda between Mexico and the United States is local too.
I can remember interviewing Condoleezza Rice back before the 2000 election, and she said at that time that if Bush were elected, it would mean a new relationship between the United States and Mexico. Vicente Fox, they had a kind of this kinship. Of course, 9/11 happened. That didn't really happen. Today, I heard one analyst say that the U.S. really needs to pay attention strategically to Latin America and be more preemptive instead of waiting for things to go bad. Do you agree? Does the United States need to be more engaged?
Look, it's evident that there are pressing geostrategic challenges for the United States today. You look at the world and whether it's Crimea, whether it's some of the challenges in the Middle East, in Iraq and Afghanistan, growing tensions in the South China Seas, it's evident that the United States is looking at these issues on a day-to-day basis, and that sometimes the hemisphere falls behind. I think it's more an issue of whether there's enough bandwidth in the United States government and in Washington so that enough political capital can be targeted at engaging holistically and in a forward-looking manner, engaging with the region. I think the president's very brave and very important decision to normalize diplomatic relationships with Cuba a few weeks before the next Summit of the Americas in Panama could set the stage for a very interesting period of engagement between the United States and some of its hemispheric partners. Again, remember that there are 3 Latin American countries that are negotiating the TPP with the United States and Canada: Chile, Mexico, and Peru. Trade, this what I call coalition of the free trade, willing these countries that have free trade agreements between themselves and with the United States at the same time, could allow the United States to do more, instead of trying to develop grand visions for the hemisphere to develop a la carte, case by case, issue-driven diplomacy with sub-regions or subgroupings of nations in the hemisphere. And I think that what we may see coming out of the Summit of the Americas in Panama hopefully could be a rethinking of how the hemisphere works together.
You know, you brought up some of these geopolitical issues. You know, when you look at Ukraine, the Mideast, this pivot to Asia that we've talked about so much on this broadcast. But the President of the United States has done a couple of things before the year ended. One, of course, immigration reform. The other, Cuba, which you alluded to. How is that playing in Mexico? How is that helping to define this relationship?
Look, Mike, there are three issues that in the past decade, and probably in the case of Cuba, even longer than that, have determined the way the Latin American nations look at and engage with the United States. Cuba, immigration, and the fight against transnational organized crime. I think that on both in regards to immigration reform and the president's decision to provide administrative relief to close to 5 million undocumented migrants living in the United States, his decision to normalize relationships with Cuba, I think these two issues will play generally very well in Latin American capitals. The big 800-pound gorilla in the room today is how the United States moves to ensuring that what it is doing domestically in terms of drug policy, the legalization of drugs, of marijuana, in Colorado, in Washington, and its international positions on interdiction of marijuana, this is one area where they will have to converge because there's a disconnect between what the United States is doing domestically and what it is doing internationally. This is probably the one issue of those three that I mentioned that I think will create some important discussions in Panama during the Summit of the Americas. But I think that in general, both the decision on immigration and the decision on Cuba have created a very positive synergy for the U.S. and for President Obama in Latin America.
One final question before we go. That 800-pound gorilla, what should the United States be doing that would make it more favorable with its Latin American brethren?
Well, Mike, I think your viewers will understand that it's going to be very hard to convince some Latin American nations that they continue to invest blood, sweat, tears, treasure, manpower in eradicating and interdicting marijuana into the United States if two states in the Union have already legalized. It's very hard to continue to pursue that type of policy. So at some point, I think the leadership of the United States in slowly revisiting the paradigms with which it and the international community have confronted the trafficking of illicit substances is going to be a very important step. I think the administration has the right ideas as how to start rethinking drug policy. I think you've seen it both in terms of how the Justice Department has reacted to what has happened in Colorado and in Washington. You've seen it as to Attorney General Holder's decisions regarding incarceration of individuals charged with drug possession or drug consumption of substances like marijuana. So what I think a lot of Latin American leaders will look to the United States to do is in the following months and years to start developing that same type of blue sky thinking or out-of-the-box thinking as it comes to international drug control policy in the Americas.
Ambassador, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks so much for your time. Appreciate it.